this might be an appropriate time to describe a little bit about these personality disorders, because I think what you'll hear is that there's a lot of consistency there. So borderline personality disorder is a disorder of stability. It's instability, and it's instability in personal relationships, it's instability in their emotions, it's instability in their behavior, and it's instability in their sense of self and their identity. And that instability is really driven by this underlying terror of abandonment. So one of the key features also of this disorder, and all of it is like pistons of an engine kind of firing off and igniting one another. But when somebody is afraid of being abandoned by their partner or by anybody else in their environment and they have this disorder, they'll make desperate attempts to prevent that from happening. And those desperate attempts could be physical aggression, it could be threatening, it could be harming themselves. But these are behaviors that are usually very extreme and very concerning to the people around them. The anger is typically what, sadly, it's counteracted, right? So the thing these people fear most is being abandoned, but over time, the anger, the explosive anger that they show when somebody is needing space, or when somebody's really not doing anything wrong, because a lot of times they read into things that they perceive as being a slight to them or being somebody intending to harm them that actually isn't happening. They'll exaggerate it, and they'll explode. They'll react in this heightened manner that is just exhausting for their partners. Oftentimes their partners will try to make them happy at first and really allow themselves to be a punching bag, thinking that they can somehow solve this problem, that somehow they can make this better, and eventually it just overwhelms them.
Are you familiar with the term emotional reactivity?
I am.
What is that?
So emotional reactivity is very common in the diagnosis. So essentially, like I said, there's instability in emotions. People with borderline personality disorder are often misdiagnosed as having bipolar disorder because they can be up and down. They can look very depressed and they can look very elated, but these changes are happening within a matter of hours. Somebody with bipolar disorder, this is a clinical depression lasting days, weeks, a clinical mania where sometimes they even need to be hospitalized because they're so grandiose. They clear out their bank account and go to Vegas and spend it all. They're acting in some very bizarre ways. With borderline personality disorder, you're having these fluctuating moods constantly. And again, this hypersensitivity to being slighted or feeling offended, really driven by the fear that if you're offended or slighted, if the therapist comes in 2 minutes late, or if somebody shows up to dinner 2 minutes late, that they might be abandoning you. And it's not as if the borderline is considering themselves abandoned in that moment, but they just know that they have this overwhelming emotion, and there are no attempts to control that emotion. There are no attempts to regulate it. So if they're in the middle of the restaurant and they feel offended, they're gonna start the fight. People are going to see it, or they might just start crying or break down, but they'll make a lot of accusations, and that reactivity is when you're gonna see a lot of this escalation in the bizarre behavior. They can react violently, they can react aggressively, they will often physically prevent their partner from trying to leave if their partner wants to get space from all of this intense emotion, and oftentimes they will be abusive to their partners in these situations. Sometimes they'll physically restrain them from leaving and become injured that way, but also people with borderline personality disorder, it seems to be a predictive factor for women who implement violence against their partner. And one of the most common tactics that they'll use is actually physically assaulting and then getting harmed themselves, but mostly we call this administrative violence. So essentially this is saying that they'll make threats using the legal system. So they might say that they are going to file a restraining order or claim abuse, or they might do these things to essentially try to keep their partner from leaving. In the moment, again, they're not consciously thinking, I'm gonna keep my partner from leaving right now. They're just thinking, I can't stand this, I hate my partner. They went from idealizing to suddenly devaluing because of the hurt, and they'll do anything to express that big emotion of anger.
You were talking about emotional reactivity. What, if any, emotional reactivity did you observe in your review? And let's do this one at a time.
Okay. So there were a couple indications to me. First, I can sort of think about it with the treatment records. So particularly Dr. Cohen-Connell's, am I getting the name right? I feel like for some reason in my mind I might have just reversed it. But Dr. Cohen's records, I did reverse it. He actually refers to this reactivity quite a bit and to Ms. Heard's temper. And that temper, it's often branded, or being hot-headed, is really characteristic of borderline personality disorder, as is their very charming, personable nature. This is a disorder of contradictions. And there was also an indication actually in Dr. Hughes's, Dr. Hughes is a forensic psychologist who had been appointed by Ms. Heard to conduct as an evaluation as well. In Ms. Hughes's interview of Ms. Heard disclosed that she had cut her arm in the past, which is a typical reactive type thing somebody with this diagnosis can do. It's one of the symptoms. And that's sort of all I can think of top of my mind from the treatment records. Moving into some of the declarations or deposition testimony, what struck me was Ms. Raquel Pennington's testimony. She's a former friend of Ms. Heard's, and she indicated, she told a story about, I suppose they were shopping for Thanksgiving accoutrements, something to prepare for Thanksgiving, and Ms. Heard struck her in the face, sort of out of the blue, which is, I thought was interesting, because that is one of those signs of borderline personality disorder where if a friend or a loved one isn't meeting your needs in that moment, people with borderline personality disorder can be very caring in their relationships as long as their needs are being met. They feel that their needs should be met when they want them met at a specific level, and if they're not, then that anger, that sense of harm, causes them to react. So the striking Ms. Pennington, per Ms. Pennington's report in the declaration, or the testimony, I thought was pretty consistent. The person with borderline personality disorder, things are in these extremes, this black and white, we call it splitting. And so that person goes from being idealized, the perfect person, to dumpster. They are totally devalued. They are the worst friend. They don't care anything about me. I have better people around. And then there will be a repair, because the person with this disorder does feel remorseful after they have these reactions, angry, tell their friend off. But over time, it wears away at these relationships. And so what you'll usually see is many, many transitions in their friendships over the years, people who have sort of fallen by the wayside, who were really very close-knit at one time, and then, but there's not a lot of consistency in the long term. You'll also see that with their intimate relationships, many, many relationships, but none that are particularly long-term.
In addition to borderline personality disorder, I understand that you diagnosed another personality disorder. What's that?
So histrionic personality disorder, and these are really two sides of the same coin. They belong to the same cluster. We call these clusters. It's a way to organize personality disorders in that DSM. And this cluster is described as the personality disorders that are dramatic, erratic, and emotional. Okay, so unpredictable, but really having to do with emotions and relationships. They're very similar. Whereas I was saying that borderline personality disorder, a lot of the key features that you're going to notice are instability. When it comes to histrionic, a lot of the key features are going to be drama and shallowness. Similarly, with borderline personality disorder, there's this underlying drive of avoiding abandonment. With histrionic personality disorder, that underlying drive is to always be the center of attention. Because if you don't have that attention on you, it feels similarly to borderline personality disorder. You feel pretty empty, like you don't have that sense of being or of value, okay? So whereas borderline personality disorder might have more of the visible reactivity if somebody seems to be leaving, with histrionic personality disorder, what you're going to see is extreme discomfort with not being the center of attention, extreme efforts to be the center of attention, and when they feel that they're not the center of attention, you will see some strange things, making up stories to try to get attention, often taking on a victim or princess role. Those two roles in particular are pretty consistent. Seeking caretaking. Borderline personality disorder is similar because with borderline personality disorder, these shifts of identity and the splitting, you might see somebody go from being, in the DSM it describes it as a needy supplicant of help, seeking the perfect caretaker, to suddenly being the avenger against injustice or thinking that their partner is a terrible person. With histrionic, what you'll see is somebody who wants to be the center of attention, has sort of that impressionistic speech, very flowery, very enthusiastic, but nothing's really being said. The moment your attention wears away, because they're so demanding for attention, that's when they might take the victim role or the princess role and even make up stories. Sometimes those stories are to bolster the victim role. Sometimes those stories are just to make them look more interesting or accomplished in their mind so that they can get respect and attention that way.
Is there a relation between histrionic personality disorder and attractiveness?
There is, strangely, and this is always one of the trickiest things to talk about because how is that a symptom? But characteristically, people with this disorder are very, very interested in looks, but more importantly, they utilize their looks to get that attention, to get that respect that they're seeking. And so this type of a personality might be flirtatious with everybody. Characteristically, they actually couldn't even be subtly, and when I say flirtatious, I'm not talking overtly sexy, but kind of inappropriately flattering. And this will even occur in their therapy relationships as a way to sort of avoid getting negative feedback or criticism. Oftentimes they'll bring the therapist gifts or be distracting if they engage in therapy because they just don't want any criticism. They want the therapist to like them.